Hi, everyone, and welcome to Unit 4 of the Research Methods IHMN 315. This unit, we're taking a look at research samples and exactly how you develop your research samples, what's important about it, why does it matter, things like that, and just some simple things about calculating the number of people you need to talk to. Okay? Before we get into all of the nuts and bolts, though, I just wanted to go through a few things that are in the news. Of course, I guess the big thing that's in the news everywhere, and granted, it's not directly tourism and hospitality related, but definitely could have implications on it, is the President of the United States testing positive for COVID, as well as several of the people around him, including his wife and various other members and senators that are involved with him. So at this point, while I'm recording this message, uh, he is in hospital, and I guess where things go from here, we'll just have to wait and see. So that's where that's at. But inevitably, there will be some implications, whether it's new perspectives on just how vulnerable people are, um, maybe greater realization of just how infectious it is, um, as well as, various other policy and procedural things which could fall out from this. So I guess uh, main thing on that is to just stay tuned. Next point that I've got there with is the registration is open for TIAC Tourism Congress. And TIAC, in case you don't know, is the Tourism Industry Association of Canada. And every year, the Industry Association has a congress somewhere across Canada. But of course, given COVID and everything like that, they've had to go virtual. On the, I guess, on the positive side of that, and we'll see if this continues on into the future, they've actually opened up registration for whomever wants to be a part of it, and registration is free this year. So if you have any interest in finding out what's going on with tourism within Canada, as well as tourism to Canada, I'm not sure about all the different topics that they're going to be looking at, but take a look, check out the link there, register if you're interested. The one thing to also think about with all of these sorts of congresses or webinars, things like that, is that if by chance you cannot attend, quite often a lot of these uh, sessions are being taped, and they will send you the tape or a link to the tape afterwards. So even if you might be busy during some of the sessions or not able to go to, virtually the Congress, might be worthwhile signing up for it anyways. And also wanted to point out some of the latest Destination Canada research. If you haven't already gone to the Destination Canada website, check it out. They've got a range of different results and information and things like that of what's going on in the world, what's going on in tourism in Canada. They do have some market profiles, things like that. Um, so very useful information. Well, now, this really isn't any big surprise, of course, but taking a look at the international arrivals to Canada, and this graphic really just brings it home. just what's happened to our international travel market in Canada. You can see in March and April, when things would normally be kind of starting on their way up, that's when all of our markets shut down. Flights into Canada all shut down. And you can see since April, the numbers have been just hovering very, very low all the way up until now. And until things change, until some of the processes open up, until more markets and more confidence is gained, it's likely to stay like this for a while. Now, if you're monitoring where things are going, you can read about all the different stories of things that some of the airports and airlines are doing in order to try to make things better, instill confidence, make sure that they're tracking COVID and what's going on. So, quite a range of things occurring. But as of now, currently, not a whole lot of change when it comes to the markets and international travel and tourism. So, just something to again keep an eye on. Unfortunately, of course, as you can see by this graphic, Canada has basically missed out on that huge bump of our summer traffic. So you can just think about all of the implications of what that means for all of the businesses, tourism and hospitality businesses within Canada. So, like I said earlier, this unit we're talking about sampling and um, not about food sampling, although I wanted to kind of get your attention with that image on the side, but really about when we're talking about sampling, um, the people that you're getting to answer your surveys, things like that, the different respondents that maybe you're either talking to or even just observing. Um, Essentially, who becomes a part of your research. Now, an important consideration first is before we even start talking about sample, we have to talk about the population. And this may sound kind of funny and obvious, but when you're talking about population, it's a much different concept or idea than what you would normally, when you're talking to your friends and that sort of thing. When you're talking about population, there's a much greater importance or much different, I guess, perspective on what population means as opposed to when it comes to research. So in research, when we're talking about population, we're talking about who are all of the people within that that we're looking at, that this research is going to be applied to, that when we're talking about the results, those are the people that this results are important. This is who they mean. And you have to be very, very clear about who that population is. And that's for a variety of reasons. For example, it really matters when you're talking about the research results as who the research results are actually working for. It matters when you're trying to figure out who you're going to talk to and how you're going to talk to them and things like that. So defining your population is kind of that first step when you're trying to figure out your respondents and your research. Lots of different ways you can define your population. Um, you can go basically by demographics, and some of these you may have heard before, some of them maybe not, but demographics, we're talking about things like age, gender, maybe your ethnic background, where you are geographically located, how much you earn, all of those sort of basic characteristics about people. Psychographics, though, is a slightly different way of looking at people, looking at the population. And when we're talking about psychographics, we're really talking about things like values and motivations and feelings and things like that. So, for example, maybe how important the environment is to you, or your views on religion, um, your views on climate change, all those sorts of different things that aren't necessarily quite so obvious, um, and are often internal to people. Those are what we're talking about with psychographics. And the important thing to remember about with psychographics is that they tend to not be necessarily um, confined to a particular demographic. So you may find, for example, similar views on sustainability between, you know, a teenager and somebody who's in their 60s, or maybe views on travel. You might have um, males and females in a particular area having similar views about travel or about education, the importance of education, things like that. So psychographics is something that you need to dig a little bit deeper about, but they can often be a better representation of who people are and a better indicator of the behaviors that people will portray than necessarily demographics. So that's another element or another way of deciding who your population is. And then, of course, you got other things like type of activity. So maybe your population is mountain bikers, or people who like hiking, people who do stand-up paddleboarding. Again, you decide who that population is, who you're going to talk to, but also who your research results will be applicable to. Once you've figured out who your population is, then comes the sampling part. And sampling really is just dealing with the reality that unless you have a lot of time, or maybe your population is really small, or you have tons of resources, or a variety of other things, there's no way you're going to be able to talk to everybody in your population. If you do talk to everybody in your population, that's what we call a census. So that's why, if you've heard of the term census before, that's when everybody in the population is spoken to. But for almost all other types of research, that's not realistic. So we have to take a sample or just a small group that is a part of or a subset of that population. So, just as a very quick example, say you were wanting to find out views of individuals at the Vancouver International Auto Show. Back when we used to be able to go to the auto shows or big events like that. So you're trying to find out maybe their views about tourism and the auto show. Lots of different people attending the event. Those of you that might have been at one before, you look across all of the people wandering around the conference center in Vancouver, and you can see quite a few different types of people. Again, reality is you can't talk to everybody. And this is especially true if you're the one actually conducting the research. But even if you have help, chances are you can't talk to everybody, and it's not realistic to talk to everybody. And the other part of sampling is that you really don't need to talk to everybody if you do your sampling correctly. So when you go to do your sample, lots of different things you could do to choose that sample. You could basically, as people are leaving the site, just randomly choose people and survey them. Or maybe you just want to talk to a particular age group, maybe university students. So you go into the crowd and you just target university students. Or maybe you just want to talk to friends of yours, people that you know personally, and you want to find out what they thought of the Vancouver International Auto Show. All of these different groups that you might have put together, you would probably get very different responses from them. Why does it matter that you've chosen these different types of samples and you get different results from them, or potentially get different results from them? Well, it matters because that group that you've chosen to talk to respond to all your survey questions, you're using their results as kind of a surrogate, or as um, as the example for the rest of the population. Their answers represent everybody else in the group that you didn't get a chance to talk to. So whatever they told you, however they felt, the things that they thought were important, what they liked, didn't like, all those things, whatever you might have talked to them about, their suggestions for the future. You're trying to say, okay, I talked to these people, but this is what everybody is going to feel. So you can see how that small group that you talk to can have a huge influence over all of the results. And if you don't choose the right people, then what you could end up with is a very biased sample. So rather than getting a group that's representative of the population, again, however you defined your population, you get a group that is very different from the rest of the population. And what can happen then is wrong decisions are made, things are invested in that shouldn't be. Um, Companies can make mistakes. Plans and strategies may be developed based upon what they think the population wants, and instead they get a very different. They roll that decisions out, and they don't work. They're unsuccessful. So there's a whole lot of things that can occur if you don't talk to the right people, if you don't choose the right sample, and get the answers that are truly representative of the population. Give you an example, very relevant to kind of what's going on right now. Just before the 2016 US presidential elections, a lot of the polls were predicting that Hillary Clinton was going to win. In fact, they were giving her a 70 to a 90% chance of winning the election. Of course, everyone knows Donald Trump won. And he won with a fairly high margin. at least you're through the electoral colleges, which is what they use in the US to determine their president. So what happened? Why did this occur? How could those polls have been so wrong? 70 to 90% likelihood that she would win, and she doesn't. Well, lots of different things they're suggesting probably went wrong in the whole process. One, you have this thing called non-response bias, and we'll talk about some of these other aspects later, but to just put them out, something called a non-response bias. And that's basically when people don't want to answer your questions. So, and I'm sure all of you have done this sort of thing before. You get a phone call or, thing pops up on your screen and it says, do you want to answer this survey? And you go, no, not a chance. You hang up, whatever the case may be. Well, all of those people that do that don't want to answer the questions, that don't answer the survey, you don't know how they would have responded. And what can happen is the people who don't respond are such a large part of the population and have a particular point of view that you really misunderstand the population because there's a whole big segment that you never talked to. So that's what you call non-response bias. In some research, you have what's called social desirability bias, which is basically when you ask certain questions, or depending upon how you ask the question, there's sometimes kind of a feeling that there's a right answer and then how they truly feel. So, if you ask somebody about, do you recycle? People will generally, they think recycling is the right thing to do. So they'll say, yes, I recycle. How often do you recycle? All the time. But if you were to actually monitor their behavior, chances are they don't do that socially desirable act as much as they try to say that they do. But they want to look good. So that's how they answer the question. And what they suggest with some of the research that was going on was there was a lot of people who were going to vote for Trump, but they didn't want to admit that. They didn't want to say, hey, I'm going to vote for Trump because it wasn't the socially desirable thing to do. There's a difference between attitude and behavior. I may say that I feel a certain way, but then I act differently. Again, kind of like that whole recycling. I might say that I recycle all the time, but whatever the case may be, something happens, maybe it's not as convenient as it should be, whatever. I don't end up recycling as often as I should. And then there's just general overconfidence by the pollsters. They were just too sure about what they were doing, and they blew it basically. So you can see how a lot of decisions were being made based on the possibility that Hillary Clinton was going to win. She didn't, and that had a huge impact on all sorts of things by not sampling correctly and not carrying out the research as well as they could have. To try to get around or prevent some of these errors in sampling, it's important to develop what's called a sampling frame. And a sampling frame is basically just a recipe or a set of rules or guidelines for how you are going to carry out your research, how you are going to choose your particular sample within that population of people. So this is, you know, some of the things that you need to think about then with your sampling frame are things like, who are you actually going to talk to? When should you talk to them? When should you collect that data? If you remember back in the last unit, we were talking about who, what, why, where, when, and how. Of course, leaving the how to later. When we were talking about the when, one of the things we talked about there was sometimes you have to conduct the research not necessarily at the ideal time, depending upon when you need the results. So again, the when the data should be collected is something that goes into your sampling frame or your guidelines for how you're going to choose people to carry out the research or to respond to it. Important to think about when during their visit, and this is to do with tourism and hospitality, at what part of their visit do you approach them to answer the questions? Now, this might sound really obvious, if you're wanting to talk to somebody about their stay in the hotel, you need to wait until after they've stayed in the hotel. So, the time you may say is, well, when they're leaving. Unfortunately, it's not always that simple because for a lot of people, and this is sometimes with the sort of accommodations or maybe at an event or things like that, when somebody's trying to leave, when they've already had their experience, when they've already sat through the concert, to get them to stop and answer questions for a survey can be almost impossible at times. So that's where maybe ideally you're thinking, okay, I need to talk to these people after the concert, but realistically, you need to figure out a different way or a different time or a different method in order to get them to tell how they feel about something. Similar thing can occur when you're talking about spending. The absolute best time to find out how much somebody has spent on a holiday is while they're spending the money. The longer you wait between when they actually spend the money and when you talk to them, the more likely you're going to have errors. So, but you can't always talk to them when they've actually just spent the money. So there's a fine balance there between when you'd like to talk to them and when it's possible to talk to them. Where on the site, if you're talking about a location, where on the site do you actually do the interview? Just a very quick point about that. Pick a place where people are going to naturally congregate, where they're going to stop, where they're going to pause for a moment, but without being a real pain, without annoying them at that point. Who do you approach? How do you approach them? And related to that, what do you do with the group? So this is where you have to think about who your population is and whether or not your unit of sample is the group or the individual, and if you're going to be the individual, which individual within that group do you talk to? So you can see the more you think about it, the more complex this can be. What we used to do back when I worked with either Parks Canada or the Canadian Tourism Commission is to make sure that you had different people responding to these sort of questionnaires in a group. You pick the person who has the next birthday. And what you do is you say, okay, whoever has the next birthday, they're the respondent within that group, but they're responding for themselves, not for the group. And that way, it's not always the same person or the same type of person. It's not always that really outgoing person that responds to the questionnaire. It's whoever has the next birthday. So lots of different things to think about, and weighting your sample is making sure that, depending upon what you're trying to accomplish, whether or not the person that's responding actually represents an equal amount in that group. So for example, if you have maybe 60% female, 40% male in a population, making sure that when you get your research results, that your research results also represent 60% female, 40% male, regardless of how many people in each of those groups you actually talked to. That's when you talk about weighting. A little more complex than you need to know right at the moment, but again, just another consideration when you're talking about your sampling frame and things like that. Now, when it comes to actually sampling and getting your sample, there's two main types of sampling that you need to be worried about, and then various types within each one of these two main types. One is called a probability sample, and that's where you know exactly the likelihood of any particular person being chosen within a group. Or non-probability, which can vary, and it's much less clear that percentage of that person within the broader population. And this won't necessarily be exactly clear at the moment, but we'll actually take you through all these different sampling methods. This was a nice graphic that I saw that I picked up off the internet that kind of goes through, shows you all the different types. And in fact, we will be talking about all these different types of sampling, both the non-probability and the probability types of sampling that occur. So, a couple of probability samples to first present to you. You have a simple random sample. So a simple random sample, guess it says there, gives every person equal opportunity of being chosen. Just to give you a very quick example of that sort of thing. And there are these things called random tables, but there's, where computer generated, where the computer will do this for you. But to just give you an example, a simple random sample, I put all of your names on little slips of paper, put them into a hat, and randomly choose maybe 10 out of you. That was a simple random sample. Every one of you had an equal opportunity to be chosen, and I just randomly choose 10 out of that group. Another way that can occur is you have an email list, and you can actually get the computer to randomly choose 20% of them, or whatever the case may be, depending upon how many you're trying to get out of that group. So that becomes a simple random sample. A systematic sample, however, has a little more process to it, but again, gives everyone kind of an equal opportunity to be chosen. And what you do with a systematic sample is you start with maybe a list, or everyone lined up, or whatever the case may be. You start at kind of a randomly chosen number, but then from that randomly chosen first person, you go to every second or every third or every fifth or maybe every 20th person, whatever the case may be, but you use that number to always choose the next person. So just to show you here, had 10 people lined up, started with the second person and went every second person until you've gone through the entire population. So that would be an example of a systematic sampling. Very simple, but again, what you need to do is you need to have either a list of everybody or some way of first organizing all of the individuals in the group before you start to sample from it. A couple of slightly more complex ways of probability sampling. You have something called a stratified random sample, where what you first will do is you'll divide your population into 2 or more groups, and then within that group, then you randomly sample. So as the example that I've got there, maybe you've divided your population, and this is something that we actually did when I was working at the Canadian Tourism Commission, going into Mexico and wanting to understand the perceptions of Canada by people in Mexico, and we needed to talk to people who had been to Canada and those that had not, just to get an understanding of is there a different perception of Canada depending upon if people have been to Canada or not been to Canada. You might assume yes, but it was something we needed to explore. Another type of stratified sample might be maybe I separate the class into males and females, or students who have studied in Canada and those who have not studied in Canada. But then once I've separated into those two groups, then again, I randomly sample from those two groups. Another way of doing this sort of sampling is something called a cluster sample. And quite often your cluster you're talking about will be a geographic cluster, just because cluster sampling works well when you're talking about geographic locations. So what you would do, for example, with a cluster sample is you take a map of the area that you're wanting to do research on. You divide that map region into smaller subregions. You randomly choose some of those smaller subregions, and then you go to just the randomly chosen subregions. I'll give an example of that. I started pre-COVID, so I had to actually pause my research, but pre-COVID, I started doing some research about the feelings about tourism and hospitality industry by people who live in the Greater Victoria Regional District, basically all the way from Sydney out to Souk. But of course, I'm not going to be able to survey everyone, and I can't randomly just pick individuals across this whole region because that would take way too much time and effort. So what I did instead was I divided up the entire region into smaller neighborhoods, and then within each neighborhood that I randomly chose, I would hand out these questionnaires to people just within that neighborhood, hoping or expecting that that neighborhood would represent the greater population. So that makes it much more realistic to do your sample in So just to show you what that might look like, here's some examples. Your simple random, just randomly choosing across the entire population. Again, maybe pulling names out of a hat or using a random number generator. Systematic, in this case, started with the second person, but then every third person within that population. The stratified sample, you can see the two groups, the group of green and blue, and then randomly choosing within that group, or the cluster sample, where there was 5 different clusters, and then it choosing 2 of the clusters out of those 5. So you can see all of these are examples of this probability sampling. Now, non-probability samples. And you have to be very careful with non-probability samples because it reduces the likelihood or the randomness that anyone within the population can be chosen. And so there's more danger of bias within a non-probability sample. However, there might be very good reasons why you do a non-probability sample. So you just have to be really careful with how you do it. First 2 examples, a quota sample. So what you're trying to do with a quota sample is getting enough people from a particular group within a population that you want to get their perspectives. So for example, maybe I want to find out all of the mountain bikers versus non-mountain bikers within Victoria. So I want to speak to 100 mountain bikers and 100 non-mountain bikers within Victoria. So I've set my quota of how many people I want to talk to from each group. Now, I have to be careful though, because I can't just combine all the results together and say, oh, this is how people feel within Victoria about whatever the case may be. Because I've probably chosen more people from that mountain biker group than are actually in the population. So if I just throw all of their information in with everybody else's and treat it as equal, then it's no longer representative, my research. However, for whatever reason, maybe I just want to make sure that I've gotten enough people from the mountain bike community to really understand how they feel. So that's why I might use a quota. Dimensional. Along a certain characteristic, you want to make sure you get enough people who have that particular characteristic to, again, to understand. So this is where, again, you might oversample or get more people who have that particular characteristic than actually exist in the population. The example there, finding out, talking to people who watch TV for 0 to 2 hours, 2 to 4 hours, or more than 4 hours daily, and getting enough people from each one of those groups so that I can understand what people are like from each of those groups. But again, I can't put all that data together into one data set because it's no longer representative of the entire population. A couple of other key examples for sampling and non-probability sampling. Convenience is a very common way of doing research, and a lot of basic research gets done that's just a convenience sample, where really you're just trying to choose the next available person, um, people who are kind of around you, people that are easy to talk to, things like that. The trouble with convenient sampling is that unless you're very careful about how you choose those people, you may have a bias towards the type of people that you talk to. So, for example, um, if you are um, maybe a university student, you might feel it you're more comfortable talking to other university students, even if university students aren't representative of the population. But it was convenient, or maybe it was convenient for you to talk to your friends and family. Again, it's a very specific type of group that you're talking to that probably are not representative of the entire population. So it sets up very, very clear limitations of how you can use the results, and you just have to be aware of those limitations. A snowball sample. Quite often you'll use a snowball sampling technique if there's a very specific type of group that you're trying to target, but you don't have a very clear or an easy way to find that particular target. So what you do with the snowball technique is you find a few representatives of that target group, and then after you've researched, after you've spoken with them, you get them to identify others from that target group that they know. So it's one of those, uh, they told two friends and they told two friends and so on. And you just kind of expand it out from those first few people that you know that are a part of that group. Again, the danger there is that they might not be representative of the general population because it's all friends of friends of friends, those sorts of things. However, sometimes that's all you can do, that's all you can rely on, because that's the only way to realistically get to some of these different groups. Again, when we were taking a look at finding out about Mexicans and how they felt about Canada as a destination, one particular group we were trying to get to were Mexicans who had been to Canada in the previous 2 years, a very specific group within a huge population that is Mexico. So we had to do that sort of snowball technique of first finding some people who had been to Mexico or been to Canada from Mexico in the past 2 years, and then using them to help us find others. This kind of shows you how this might look like. The snowball sample, again, finding two people from those groups and then going from there. Quota sample, specifically choosing within the population specific people from certain groups or characteristics that we're looking for. Judgment, that's where you as a trained researcher might decide particular people within that population that you want to talk to. And a convenience sample, you can see, the illustration there where that researcher, the person in gray, just chose everyone that was immediately around them. Yes, it was simple, it was easy. It might be representative, but there's a strong danger that it isn't. To kind of wrap up, or, the last thing I want to talk to about when we're talking about the sample, and one of the biggest questions I always get when we're talking about conducting research is, how many people do I have to talk to? How big of a sample do I need to make this representative? Or to make this research valid, things like that. And I guess first big thing when you're thinking about how big of a sample you need to talk to, and we'll actually be talking about it next week and the week after, is are you doing qualitative or quantitative research? Now, if you remember when we first talked about qualitative versus quantitative research, qualitative, it's more about characteristics. It's generally more open-ended. It's broader, but not necessarily representative of a particular population. The number of people you need to talk to in qualitative research is very different, and how you figure out how many people you talk to in qualitative research is very different from quantitative. With quantitative research, you're trying to get a specific number that is representative within that population. So there's very specific calculations that you can make to figure out how many people to talk to. With qualitative research, however, your sample size is really dependent upon the group that you're talking to and the sort of respondents that you get. So really what you're trying to do with qualitative research when you're talking about as a very quick and dirty rule of figuring out how many people to talk to in qualitative research is when you start hearing the same stuff over and over again in your qualitative research, then you've talked to enough people. Or another way of looking at it is if the value of the information you get from that next person isn't worth the effort of getting that next person, then you can stop your qualitative research. You can stop talking to new people. Now, I know that's not a very clean or very quick or an easy number. As a ballpark, quite often in qualitative research, you might be talking to 10 or 20 people or maybe 30 people. So fairly low numbers. However, quite often the amount of time you're having to spend with each of those people is a lot more. And what you have to do with the information is a lot more, which you'll find out next week, actually with Brian. And Brian will be your instructor for next week. With quantitative research, it tends to be less time per person that you're talking to, but you have to talk to a lot more people. And as a very quick and dirty sort of calculation or way of figuring out how many people to talk to with quantitative research, you have this equation here. And no, it's not perfect, but this equation right here will give you an idea of how many people to talk to or how big of a possible margin of error will there be in your results. Now, I know we haven't really talked about margin of error, and we'll talk about margin of error a lot more when we talk about quantitative research. But basically, margin of error is how much confidence do you have that the result you have from your research is actually the truth. It's actually real. So, and this is something that you're going to do this week for your discussion questions. But quite often with research and quantitative research, you will see something said kind of like, these research results are accurate within plus or minus, 3% or 5%, 19 times out of 20. You might have heard that expression before, you may not have paid attention to it. A lot of quantitative research will have those sort of little throwaway lines that, unless you do research, probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But basically what they're saying with some of that is that, say for example, your research says 60% of the people feel that sustainability is the most important issue right now that society is dealing with. That 60% might not be truly what it is across the entire population, because you've only done a sample. So what you do with that 60% is you take a look at that margin of error, that plus or minus whatever percent, and it helps you estimate that the actual number is going to be somewhere in that range. So say your margin of error is plus or minus 5%. So that means the actual number of people feeling that the environment is the most important is between 55% and 65%, that plus or minus 5%. So, and that margin of error will get smaller the bigger the size of your population. This calculation here is just a very quick and dirty ballpark. But to give you an example, so if your quantitative sample is 100 people in a broader population, your margin of error is plus or minus 10%, roughly. If you survey 200 people, your margin of error goes down to about 7%, so plus or minus 7%. 400 down to 5%, and you can see all the way down to, so when you talk to 10,000 people, you still have a margin of error of roughly 1%. Now, to just quickly point out something before we move off of this table, you can see from just going from 100 to 200 people, our margin of error dropped by 3%. Then I had to go from 200 up to 400, or another 200 people, and it dropped only by 2%. I go from 400 to 1,000 people, so 600 more people that I had to talk to there, and it hasn't even gone down by 2%. It's only gone down by 1.8%. So you can see that reduction in that margin of error becomes smaller and smaller as I get a bigger sample. Why does this matter? Why should you care about any of this sort of thing? Well, actually choosing how many people do I need to talk to, that's one of the things that you're going to be thinking about. You're going to be thinking about, okay, if I talk to, in this example, 400 people, and maybe those 400 people, it costs me $4,000 to survey those 400 people, I end up with that plus or minus, well, in this case, 4.9%, but basically 5%. Or I could talk to 1,000 people, which costs me $8,000, and my margin of error is down to 3.1%. So one of the things that I, as a researcher, have to decide is, I've just spent $4,000 more to talk to 1,000 people instead of 400. That margin of error went from roughly 5% down to 3%. Am I that concerned about that margin of error, or the possibility of making an error, making a mistake? Is it worth that extra $4,000 for that slight change in that potential margin of error? So this is one of the sorts of things you as a researcher have to actually decide, have to determine, is it worth the extra resources to talk to that next group of people? So, and we can talk about this a bit further, or if this isn't entirely clear, please get in contact with me. This might be one of those situations where it's easier for me to talk you through this than through these slides. Okay, so please, if this doesn't make if this isn't totally clear to you, please talk to me. Please get in touch with me. So for this discussion questions, what I want you to do is find the results for a recent bit of research or poll or something like that. And when I say recent, I mean either 2016 or newer. So nothing older than 2016. It does not have to be part of tourism and hospitality. It can be in anything. A lot of political polling going on right now, but find out whatever you want. But you need to find fairly recent research or poll. What I want you to do is take a look, read through those research results, and you might not get it from the first bit of research that you take a look at, so you may have to search around a bit to find other bits of research. But I want you to find out, first off, what do they tell you about the respondents, the sample? So for example, what sorts of people responded? Where were they from? How were they contacted? How many people were contacted? Secondly, did they tell you in the research about the timing of the research? So when were those people contacted? And this is where you have to think about, okay, what else might have been occurring, or do they say something in that research results about what was going on either before or after the research was conducted? So maybe, for example, as a prime example right now, right after a presidential debate, they do a survey. So understanding that it came right after a debate having impacts on people's perceptions or ideas, possibly. Maybe asking people about tourism and hospitality just after the coronavirus shut everything down. So sometimes these environmental effects, things that are occurring in the world at the time, will affect how people respond to a questionnaire. It's important to understand the context of what was going on when that research was occurring. And who commissioned the research? Who's the person behind the research being conducted? What do you know about them? Who paid for the research? Are they neutral, leaning left, as in socialist, or right, more business oriented? Based on all of this information, based on all of these sorts of things about who was contacted, how were they contacted, everything like that, I want you to make a judgment about how much confidence you have in the results of the information. And this is just going to be an educated guess by yourself, but this is where I want all of you to start thinking about research and research results and research being conducted, and to realize that there's a lot of research out there that gets published. There's a lot of research that gets talked about, especially in the news, that needs to be looked at much more closely, because the headline does not tell the whole story. The headline, a lot of headlines are put out there to make headlines, but when you dig a bit deeper into the actual research, how it was conducted, who was talked to, who compiled the results, all this sort of stuff, it can make you really question the results that they've presented. However, unless you've done that research, unless you've looked at things a bit deeper, you can see how research results get really spread everywhere in the news, and they may not be as accurate or as useful as the news services like to say. So just some things that I want you to think about for this week. Very quick example, and you can see down at the bottom, there's a link there. Now, because I'm presenting this to you, I don't want any of you to use this particular bit of research or this particular poll, but this is on the CBC website. They're talking about elections, and what they're actually doing is they've taken a bunch of other polls and combine them together to see where the country is as far as federally, number of people that are being for the different parties. From this table, you can see exactly when the different research occurred, who conducted the research. If you clicked on any of those links, you can actually dig a bit deeper and find out who probably paid for the research or potentially paid for the research. Shows you the size of the sample. So how many people were in that particular group, that particular sample, how much weight CBC is giving to the results of each of these different polls. So they've decided that certain polls are worth more towards the overall average than others. It even tells how the different research was conducted. So you can see that most of them are through the internet, although you notice one says IVR, and that was an interactive voice system through phone calls, and then MOE, and that's your margin of error. So you can see how you've got plus or minus 2%, 2.5%, and if you were to use that calculation that I showed, that 1 over the square root of n, you would get pretty close to what those numbers are if you want to try it out. Anyways, just an example. Very quick summary. The sample is so incredibly important to the validity and confidence that you have in the research results. So that's why it's important to take your time and really understand population, your sample, how you're going to sample them, how you're going to talk to all these different people. All of these sort of things play such a huge role in the research that you need to really carefully think through this part of your process when you're developing a research plan. Your text has a few extra bits of reading. If you want some other research readings, let me know. I can provide them to you. And that's it. So have a great day, and thank you for listening to me today. Take care.